Hi there, this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, and welcome to another random review. Now you might think 2024 has been the year of Hideo Gosha for me and Kahachi Okamoto, and you'd probably be right. We're going to look at 1965's Fort Graveyard by Okamoto, starring Toshiro Mifune and Tatsuya Nakadai. My favourite film of the year so far, I think, is Samurai Assassin by Okamoto, but O Bomb by Okamoto and The Wolves by Gosha and several other Gosha films, and Fort Graveyard might be in that conversation as well by Okamoto. Now I did a review of Red Lion, I was talking about the comedy in the first half doesn't really work with the comedy, with the seriousness of the second half. Fort Graveyard has comedy throughout, but it is black comedy. It does have that same kind of absurdist streak as in Okamoto's O Bomb. It has a kind of absurdist streak like Richard Lester's How I Won the War. Now it's not as flagrant or blatant as How I Won the War, but the setup is kind of sort of similar as far as in How I Won the War. Michael Crawford's platoon has to go behind enemy lines to make a cricket pitch. And Fort Graveyard involves a military band actually being asked to fight and be soldiers. So it stars Mifune and Nakadai. It's 1965, and these two actors are absolute titans, and their scenes together are absolutely magnificent. They both punch each other in the mouth. So the setup is Mifune has been thrown out of general headquarters for subordination, and he turns up at Nakadai's command looking for an apprentice officer. And he turns up just as this apprentice officer is being executed for desertion from Fort Graveyard. The clue's in the name. His platoon was wiped out, as he says, but Nakadai literally just executes them as soon as Toshiro Mifune turns up. The film is set in August 1945 in Manchuria. So this is the last days of World War II for Japan and their invasion of China. So it's literally the dog days of the war, and Mifune, strangely enough, doesn't agree with Nakadai executing this apprentice officer, and we find out later in the film why. So he punches Nakadai in the face, and Nakadai then punches Mifune in the face. So he's thrown into jail awaiting a court-martial. You also have the wonderful Yunosuke Ito, who was the lead in O Bomb, and he's a familiar face, the guy with the kind of long horsey face. And Makoto Seto, again, you'll recognise him. He's the cook. And Ito is constantly telling people, oh, you can escape, and I won't say anything if you escape. So he ends up being thrown into prison as well, because he's overheard saying to Mifune that he knows a way of how he can escape. Ito is one of the comedy relief in the film, very much like, well, comedy in general. You're either going to get it and think that it works for the film, or you're not. I think as ridiculous as it is, I think the humour in this film does work because it is a kind of absurd, horrific setup. So Nakadai decides, instead of having a court-martial for Mifune and a couple others, he'll send them with the military band. So it's 13 kids basically under the age of 20, and he'll send Mifune in charge of these 13 kids, and Ito's character, who's known as the Mortician, because that's what he did in peacetime, and he's always worried about looking after the bodies, and the cook. He sends them to Fort Graveyard to take back Fort Graveyard, because Nakadai sees it as an important stepping stone in the war. So Nakadai isn't in the film a ton. He's in it for the first chunk and then interspersed towards the end. So he gives a much more, controlled performance. He's the voice, kind of authority. You could see the actors swapping roles because they're both that flexible to do so. But Mifune is the older actor who's been around. He's got service medals. And Nakadai is the younger officer who is seems to be fairly cold, but does have these moments of humanity. So Mifune gets a couple of days to train this military band of 13 kids who haven't seen any combat. But Okamoto uses a kind of Peter and the Wolf technique of each member of the band gets a little intro note of his instrument whenever the camera goes to them or whether they're introduced. So you've got the big drum and the small drum, you've got trombone, clarinet, tuba. There's even a tuba farting joke. And that way you get to know these kids, because like all good war films, you do actually care about some of the characters. War films that people are just faceless and cannon fodder, you tend not to actually empathise with them, because it's like slasher films. The characters usually are so paper thin that you don't actually care, and you're more interested in the deaths than the actual lives. Whereas this film doesn't have that. You do care about these kids, and people that you care about die, just like in life. It's the same in war. So he gets a couple of days to train them. So there's nice things like the rhythm of the machine guns. He tells them that's just like the rhythm of a song, so you know when to run when the machine gun finishes its rhythm. So there's nice kind of touches like that. He uses, at one point he asks if anybody's played baseball, and one of them says yes, so he ends up being essentially the pitcher and throwing grenades. So there's nice little touches like that. So it takes a good chunk in the film to get to know everybody, which again, you're perfectly happy spending time with these characters, because again, it's not as if Nakadai is just like a one-dimensional monster or anything like that. And then you have the journey to Fort Graveyard, and then their attempt to take Fort Graveyard and hold Fort Graveyard. There are moments where they play as a band, and this is, I guess, where part of the absurdity goes in. to track the enemy, or and you'll either find stuff with the band kind of funny and sometimes moving, or you won't. It might be a kind of Marmite film for some people. You might love it, or you might just think it doesn't work. The whole kind of, allegory of music and being in harmony in relation to being at war. And again, I've seen comments about, why should we feel sorry for Japanese soldiers? Because Japan did terrible things during the war. And it's like, name a country who fought in the war that didn't do terrible things to each other. Again, this is about kids. Many of them have never had sexual relations. There is a female character in the film, Uharu, not from the life of Uharu, a different Uharu, who is a military prostitute. Yes, the Japanese army had military prostitutes. And has a relationship with Mifune that is deeper than just money. So she almost becomes the mother of the unit, even though she does service them all, to have most of them lose their virginity. And as we know from slashers, if you lose your virginity or have sex, you're generally going to die. The film is absolutely wonderful. It's 132 minutes. As I said, people you care about die in horrible ways. There is comedy, and personally I think the comedy works. Some of it perhaps not. Yunosuke Ito is more of the broader comedy, but it does come from a believable place of the fear, especially again that period literally right at the end of the war, where people just want to survive and get home. There's a real palpable sense of that. It is a horrible film as well. It doesn't skirt from, people you care about will die, and you just have to accept that and move on. Mifune, I talked about again in my review of Red Lion, which you can look at. I did say kind of another character in that film is probably more interesting than the Mifune character, and Mifune's performance, it's the kind of performance he does in his sleep. This one is far better. Again, I don't know whether it's because Nakadai is involved, but again, as I said, when the two of them get together, it's better than Al Pacino and Robert De Niro in Heat. Their scenes together just crackle with electricity. Again, neither of them are like showboating or doing George C. Scott, but the energy in the room when the two of them are together is quite something to behold. And if you love your bleak, brutal war films, just about the pointlessness and absurdity of it, especially near the end of the war, this one should be right up your street. Again, this isn't necessarily an official DVD, but the print is absolutely excellent. Again, all these Okamoto films that I'm watching, all these Hideo Gosha films I'm watching, really need to get Blu-ray releases. Something like Samurai Assassins, an absolute masterpiece, and it's not on Blu-ray. Again, the thing, as a kid, this kind of came about, this me kind of concentrating on getting rid of my Japanese backlog to some extent, came about, if you haven't watched any of the other videos, from, I was going to do my favourite 25 Japanese directors, and then I realised I had like 55 candidates, so I really wanted to watch as many of their films as possible to do a more accurate list at some point. Granted, that will probably be next year at this point, in this progress, But I mean, Okamoto, Masamura, Gosha, I mean, they have rocketed up the board. And again, you know, they're not as well known or not as flashy or not as sexy perhaps, as they kind of do more work in genre films. But they really need more exposure. Hopefully Radiance will do that. I know they have dug into the Tai Kato films, but I mean, personally I've enjoyed all those Kato films, but for me at least, I don't think Kato, well, out of those films that Radiance have released, I don't think Kato is close to Okamoto or Gosha or Masamura, but again, that's just my personal preference. They are going to release an Oshima box set next year. Again, I'm not as high on Oshima as other people, but hopefully down the road they'll get into, I know Arrow's released a few Masamuras, but hopefully Masamura, Okamoto and Gosha get more Blu-ray releases, because some of these films are absolutely marvellous. And again, you've got films with Toshiro Mifune, Shimura, Nakadai all together, or combinations of the two. You know, you can't get enough Nakadai. And obviously there's still a ton of Kobayashi that you can't really get on proper releases either, which is ridiculous. I did actually see, I can't even remember what the website was, but I saw a list, and I don't know who compiled it, of the best 250 directors in cinema history, and I know these things are not to be taken seriously, but Kobayashi was 206th. Yeah, and needless to say, Gosha and Okamoto and Masamura were nowhere to be seen. So apologies for that little rant, but that's all to say that there are so many great Japanese directors. That's why it is my favourite country for producing films, and again, that's why I really need to knuckle down and get through my Japanese film backlog as much as possible. Again, I'll still be watching films from other countries, but this Okamoto vein, this Masamura vein, this Gosha vein is rich, so rich, especially if they keep working with people like Mikao Wakao and Tatsu Nakadai and Yunosuke Ito and Mifune and Shimura, and Tomasaburo and Yakahama and people like that. Tetsuro Tamba. Oh, fantastic. So thanks very much for watching. Please let me know if you've seen Fort Graveyard. I think it's also known as Blood and Sand, perhaps, which sounds like a gladiator film. Please let me know if you have seen Fort Graveyard, what you think of it, and what other Japanese directors really need Radiance box sets. No pressure, Radiance or anything. And I'll see you for more random reviews, some of which may be Japanese. This is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, saying farewell.